In this episode, I'm going to talk about trap answer choices for the reading section. These are patterns that I've noticed having tutored for so long, having taken so many practice tests of the new SAT, the old SAT. There are definitely some patterns in how the SAT produces wrong answers, and I hope to give you a sense of that. But it's a complicated idea, so I want you to make sure that you've got the baseline down. Specifically, dumb summaries, the main strategy for the reading section. And it basically comes down to we can't just understand everything in a passage. There's way too many details. So what we're going to do instead is try to boil it down to some simpler ideas. And the dumb summary is the way to do that. A lot of times thinking about connotation. I talked about a little bit more advanced version of this where we think about strong words. If there are lots of words in a passage, which are the ones that matter most? We need to be able to identify strong words that are going to help us understand the passage, and also strong words in the choices that might make them right or wrong. And specifically in this episode, we're going to really focus on strong words in the choices, words that in many cases you don't recognize as being strong, and that's why we fall for these trap answers. They don't seem bad, but they actually have really consistent problems that I'm hoping to show you how to identify. So let's dive right into an example here. I'm going to read it, just give us the basic sense of what it's about. As a video game animator, Phoebe Shackleton finds inspiration in her own backyard, waiting patiently and observing the natural movements of local species. For example, she designed the frantic scurrying of Brimbles, fictional monsters from the Future Home video game series, by watching chipmunks dash between hiding places outside her Pennsylvania cabin. When the animals are nowhere to be found, Shackleton can be seen sketching the subtle swaying of leaves and branches in a breeze. She believes that mimicking these tiny details from the real world contributes to the immersive experience of a video game world. And our question is pretty standard: which choice best states the main idea of the text? And I'm just going to tell you right away, choice A is the answer. Shackleton gets design inspiration from the natural world around her. So hopefully that just feels right to you, right? They talk about Shackleton, they talk about where she's getting her inspiration for the video games. It's coming from nature. So choice A kind of checks things off. But I want to give you this kind of easy answer to this easy passage so that we can see more clearly how the SAT is going to manipulate us and give us answers that kind of hit certain other main ideas from the passage, but then also have a problem that we might ignore if we're not thinking clearly or just moving too fast. So let's start with a really simple change to choice A. Choice B. Shackleton gets most of her design inspiration from the natural world around her. So this really wouldn't happen on an SAT where you'd have choices that are this similar, but for this purpose of making a point, I want to show you what happens when we add in just these three words, most of her design inspiration. So for many people, if they had choice B on a test, and not choice A, just choice B, they would read choice B as if it were basically saying choice A. They wouldn't notice any difference. But there is a difference, a big one. To say that Shackleton gets most of her design inspiration from the natural world is to say that more than half of her ideas come from there, 51%. Most is a very specific word. It's a strong word that we need to pay attention to, even though it seems like it's not really doing a lot of work in this choice. And that's the thing, is these are very subtle words that we might not think of as strong right away. But this passage is only about her inspiration of the natural world, so why can't B be correct? Well, most is so specific that we need to find another strong word that kind of hits that same specific idea in the passage. Now, it only talks about her inspiration from the natural world, but it never rules out that she's not getting inspired from other places. And we're not allowed to assume that's what's happening, right? This is just one example of where her inspiration comes from. We're not getting the specifics about other things. Let me give you another example here that's a little bit different, and you can see where this is going. Chipmunks have been Shackleton's primary source of animation ideas. Well, yeah, it seems pretty good. They talk about the chipmunks. It seems to be a pretty important example that inspired her. But I'm bothered by the word primary. That's another very strong word. Now, they listed this example of the Brimbles and the chipmunks, but that doesn't mean that it was the main example. It was the main thing that inspired her. It's just the thing that they happened to talk about in this very short passage. So we're not allowed to give it this importance. So the word primary here would really jump out to me. But again, most people would ignore it, focusing on the other parts of choice C that actually do seem supported by the passage. And the common feature of both B and C is we have words that try to have a quantity attached to them. They involve number in some way. And so some other words that might do that: many, most, all, few, consensus, every, none, primary, major, minor, numerous, widely. All of these words in some way convey an idea of number. And this is an important idea that might be right, but it's something we would need to prove with the passage. So when I see words like this in answer choices, I'm instantly on edge. I don't necessarily cross the choice out, but I need to prove those words with something equivalent in the passage. And A doesn't have those, right? It stays away from the numbers. And we can see why maybe that is easier to prove is it doesn't have that extra little specific piece. So a very common trap on the SAT involves things being quantified in some way. So hopefully this sticks with you, and a word like most or primary that you might otherwise ignore will now jump out as being something at least worthy of being considered before you pick the answer. Let me show you some other kinds of traps that might show up. Choice D. Shackleton finds it easier to sketch the movements of plants than those of animals. Well, again, that kind of makes some sense. They talk about the chipmunks, they talk about plants, and it probably does make sense that it would be easier to sketch a plant than an animal, right? Plants don't run away in the wild, so you're probably going to have an easier time of it. But does it actually say that it's easier? That word is very strong. It's a word that implies some sort of comparison. And yes, this passage is talking about both of those examples, but does it compare them? Does it rank them and tell us that one is better than the other? No, they just happen to be two different examples, and we're not allowed to make assumptions about which one is better unless they explicitly tell us in the passage. So lots of comparison words come up in answer choices. More, less, increase, decrease, fewer, likely, unusually, same, equal, compare, contrast. All of these words are trying to get us to rank things and compare their attributes, and we have to make sure that the passage is doing that as well. If it's not, then we can't justify a choice like choice D. Let's look at choice E, which I know the SAT does not have an actual choice E, but it makes it easier to have different letters. Shackleton cannot design a new video game creature without a real-world analog. Well, again, all the examples that we get in this passage have to do with her copying something in the real world. But to say that she can't design a new video game creature without there being some real world thing, that's a big leap. That's a very strong claim that would need to be supported. Just because she does occasionally design some creatures based on real world things doesn't mean that she always has to do that. So choice E is adding in this idea of necessity. It must happen. Need, necessary, must, require, proof, confirm, universal, impossible. These are just some words that would scare me if I saw them in a choice. They're not always wrong, but they require some sort of proof. But notice, cannot is not the most obvious word here. It feels like it's actually not even part of the main idea of the choice, right? Otherwise, it definitely talks about Shackleton in the passage. It talks about her designing new video game creatures, and it talks about her using the real world. So other parts of this choice check out. They seem to be okay. And that's how the SAT comes up with traps, is most of the choice is right. 90% will be correct. But if 10% of a choice is wrong, the whole thing is wrong. And that's what we need to look for, is these kinds of 10% words that we might otherwise ignore. Let's look at choice F. The Future Home video game series is well known for its lifelike creatures and animations. Well, they definitely mention this video game series. And here, there's not a particular word that bothers me in the choice. It's more about the overall main idea of the choice. It seems to be about the Future Home video game series, but is the passage about that? No, I don't think so. So this is what I would call main character confusion. And it relates back to dumb summaries, right? If we were to summarize this passage, it's about Shackleton and how great she is as an animator, right? But is choice F about that? No, it's not about Shackleton. Now it's about the video game. Those are different main characters. So it's unlikely that choice F is going to be a good summary of what's going on in the passage if they're just focused on different things. Notice that choice A, the main character, is in fact Shackleton. So that seems to match up. And we've got to be, flexible with this word character, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a person or someone from a fictional work. In this case, the character is the video game series, The Future Home. So it just means the main idea, the main thing that the story is about doesn't match up between the choice and the passage. So it's a good way of quickly cutting down on the details and seeing that there's a mismatch between a choice and a passage. Let's look at choice G. Video game animations are often based on real-world examples. Well, okay, the first thing that bothers me is the word often. This is a word that kind of fits into another category of words that involve time in some way. Frequently, often, never, always, quick, longer, sustained, future, previous, routine. They're adding in chronology. One thing happens first, then another thing happens, or maybe something happens multiple times. These are all very strong ideas that need to be proven with the passage. So Maybe this is something that's provable. It seems like they're implying that this happens often. But the bigger issue for me in this choice is less about the specific word and more about, again, the overall main idea of the choice. It seems to be talking in a way that goes beyond what the passage is saying. So this is what I call big versus small confusion. Passages about specific examples do not support broad conclusions. So what do I mean by that? This passage is about the specific example of Phoebe Shackleton and what she does as a video game designer. Choice G is about all video game animations, right? It's a much broader claim. And so it's going beyond what we're being told. We're not allowed to take a specific example and then make some sort of broad claim, broad conclusion about everything based on that one example. And this is fighting against something that's very just human nature. We really like to take a couple of small examples and make a big claim about it. It's just easier. But we're fighting against that instinct. The SAT knows it's there, so we have to recognize when they're doing it. They make this kind of trap a lot. So just be careful, especially in science passages, that if we're getting a specific example, we're not making a bigger conclusion than we're allowed. So this also goes to show that multiple traps could be going on in one question, one answer choice. There isn't always just one word that we need to find. Sometimes there's lots of things going on in a choice. We don't need to find them all, but I hope that I've given you a little bit of a checklist to work through as you go through a question to maybe more easily identify wrong answers. So let's do that with a question in a more traditional way here. And I'm going to tell you this is a very dense science passage, so don't try to focus too much on the science. Let's just let the passage happen and we'll use the answer choices and look for strong words there. Launching anything into outer space requires solving a multitude of physical problems. Billions of dollars have been spent developing new materials, such as hydrocarbonate plastic, that can push the limits of space travel even further. To make hydrocarbonate plastic more suitable for the forces experienced during takeoff and landing, engineers experimented with various chemical blends, including polybenzene, a byproduct of natural gas refining. The addition of even a small amount of polybenzene, a compound with a high affinity for the hydrocarbonate's T receptors, significantly improved the plastic's durability without adversely affecting flexibility. You heard me stumble, right? These words are so confusing, but I don't care about the words. Let's focus on the choices. They're going to tell me what to care about. The question says, the passage indicates that the use of polybenzene allowed engineers to. Choice A, reduce the number of T receptors found in hydrocarbonate plastic. Well, reduce the number definitely sounds like some sort of quantity idea. Is it provable with the passage? They talk about the T receptors for sure, but around there, they're talking about adding in benzene, the polybenzene. So that sounds like addition, not reducing something, and it improved the durability. So again, it seems like this is moving something up, not moving something down. So I'm glad I checked, but it's easy for me to make sense now of this very complex science idea because I have a very specific thing I'm looking for, and it doesn't check out. Let's look at B. The polybenzene allowed engineers to confirm whether including chemical blends other than polybenzene would have a similar effect on hydrocarbonate plastic durability. Well, the first thing I notice is that first word confirm definitely implies the idea of necessity. So I gotta be really careful there. If it's confirmed, it's proven, it's without a doubt true. So that's something that needs to be shown in the passage. But if I keep reading, I'm also bothered by the fact that they're talking about chemical blends other than polybenzene. That sounds like a big versus small problem. This passage seems to only be about the polybenzene. So are we allowed to make some bigger claim about other chemical blends? That makes me nervous. And then if we continue, it says that they have a similar effect. And that sounds like a comparison to me. So that would need to be proven as well. There's a lot here. And we can go in here, but the biggest thing for me is that I just don't remember this passage talking about anything other than the polybenzene at all. So we're really not allowed to make conclusions about other chemical blends. So the big versus small thing is the most egregious for me here, but there are lots of reasons that we can get rid of this choice. And again, this is why we think about this as like a checklist, is you don't need to always find the same thing that I find, but if there's something wrong, there's something that needs to be proven, now the strong words jump out and we can go and look for those in the passage. Let's look at C. Polybenzene allowed engineers to modify the properties of hydrocarbonate plastic to make it more useful for spaceflight. Well, this is also a comparison, more useful, right? So should I eliminate the choice? No. The purpose of this whole exercise is not that we are allowed to just immediately eliminate answer choices when we see these problem strong words here. What we need to do is go and check for them, those ideas in the passage as well. So it's not an instantaneous get rid of this answer. Sometimes if I'm really stuck between two answer choices and one of them has like a trap word, I will eliminate it and pick the other one. But that's me just taking a smart guess. In a case like this, I want to go in and see, This is a comparison, but is it one that I can prove? It does sound like at the end there, we are using the hydrocarbonate or the polybenzene to make the hydrocarbonate improved in certain ways, its durability without affecting its flexibility. So it does seem more useful in that way. And if we go back to the beginning, to make hydrocarbonate plastic more suitable for the forces experienced during takeoff and landing, spaceflight. So we do have evidence of this comparison. So this comparison may look like a trap at first, but it's justified by the lines. That's what we're really doing here, is we're just giving ourselves something to latch onto that we can go hunting for in the passage. Let's look at D though, let's be sure. Demonstrate that polybenzene blends would be beneficial for most plastics used in spaceflight. Well, there's that quantity word, most, so I gotta be careful, but even looking deeper, big versus small, are we really talking about most plastics used in spaceflight? We seem to be talking specifically about these hydrocarbonate plastics, so I don't know, am I allowed to make this bigger claim about all plastics? I don't think so, so D is gonna be wrong, and C is gonna be the best answer here. So this question had lots of traps, and hopefully if we had that checklist in our mind, we'd be able to notice all these problems. But I think the key piece is notice how little summarizing we did of the passage. Because the passage is so dense with all this science, it's easy to even just stumble over. But the choices were easier to understand, especially when we could target specific ideas within those choices because we're thinking about potential traps, potential strong words that stand out, and then we can go looking for those ideas in the passage. That's much easier sometimes than trying to understand the passage and then looking for a choice that summarizes it. In fact, that's actually how we fall for a lot of traps. So yes, this is a complicated idea. I don't expect you to fully understand this after just 2 examples. But if you go and look at other questions from the SAT, I think you're going to start to notice these traps coming up again and again. I've definitely noticed that these things are repeated. There are patterns from one test to another, one type of SAT to another. The SAT is pretty consistent in how they come up with wrong answers. So hopefully you'll start to notice those patterns as well if you keep this as a checklist in your mind. Anytime I review a reading question, I'm going to talk about trap answers. It's absolutely the way that helps me the most thinking about the SAT and the unique way that they ask questions. You're not used to your teachers tricking you on tests. The SAT kind of has this, but if we know how they're going to trick us, we're much more able to avoid those traps and pick right answers. But it does require this process and it does require more practice, but I hope this was a good start. Thank you for watching.